Divorce lawyers, did the Ketchup fight case make you question humanity the most? Story 1. I had two couples come to me. They had been friends for nigh on 15 years. Husband A decided he liked wife B more than wife A. Wife A decided she likes husband B more than husband A. The reverse was also true. They came to me all together, and I drafted 2 sets of paperwork. A week after that, they all remarried. The husband swapped houses and they all went about their lives exactly as they had the week before, but each slightly happier. Story 2. There was this one couple who decided that to spice up their life they would invite a third person into their relationship. In this instance, they jointly found another woman they were both attracted to. They started off spending time with her together, but eventually, things became complicated. Everything came to a head when the wife realized that her husband and their new friend had formed a romantic bond that excluded her. That was when she came to me. Story 3. He loved his pinball machine collection more than her. Also, it turns out some pinball machines can be worth a surprising amount of money. Those things are incredibly complex mechanically. It's actually a big reason the prices on older machines are so high. As they break down and people don't have the skills to repair them, the supply gets lower. Story 4. A friend who specializes in family law had a client. A wife wanted to divorce her husband because he kept taking their dogs for walks while she was at work, making it so they'd rather cuddle the husband instead of her after a long day. Story 5. A client filed for divorce because he owed his bookie $70,000. He didn't want to leave his wife, but he figured he would get half the house and the divorce to pay his debts. He had already blown through their life savings gambling. Story 6. I heard of a woman that had her marriage annulled because the groom insisted on bringing his mother on their honeymoon. The bride discovered the reason was that he needed a level of maternal comfort that was completely inappropriate for a grown man on his honeymoon. Story 7 and 8. There are kings, and there are tyrants. Some rule over nations with an iron fist. Others, more modest in their ambitions, rule over a single household with an iron will. And sometimes, that will is focused on the most intimate, most personal aspect of domestic life, the bathroom. Meet the dad. We'll call him Bob. To the outside world, Bob was a perfectly normal suburban father. He coached Little League, he grilled burgers on the 4th of July, he complained about taxes. But behind closed doors, Bob was the unwavering autocrat of a brutal regime, a regime built around a single, non-negotiable law: 3 squares of toilet paper. Per trip. No exceptions. This wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a friendly household tip to save the planet. It was scripture. He would inform his family of their usage statistics at the dinner table. He kept meticulous mental spreadsheets of roll depletion rates. His children learned the art of creative folding with a desperation usually reserved for engineering students during final exams, but his genius for domestic austerity truly shone when guests came over. While his wife would offer them a drink or a snack, Bob would pull them aside for a far more serious briefing. With the gravity of a man handing over state secrets, he would lean in and explain the rule. Most guests would offer a tight, confused smile, assuming it was some kind of bizarre joke. It was not. For years, the system worked, held together by a fragile blend of fear and profound social awkwardness. But all tyrannies are destined to fall. And the catalyst for this revolution wasn't a grand uprising, but a quiet, unassuming man named Dave. Dave was visiting the house for the first time. He endured Bob's peculiar toilet paper induction speech with polite bewilderment and promptly forgot about it. Later in the evening, nature called. Dave excused himself and, in the sterile quiet of the guest bathroom, answered. It was only after the fact, when he reached for the toilet paper roll, that the terrible memory of Bob's speech came flooding back. He looked at the roll. There, mocking him, were 3, and only 3, perfectly perforated squares. He looked at his situation. He looked back at the 3 squares. An impossible equation. A crisis of logistics and dignity unfolded under the unforgiving glare of the bathroom vanity light. He was trapped. To use more would be to defy the house's strange god. To emerge from the bathroom in his current state was, to put it mildly, not an option. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a loophole, a savior. He saw nothing. Just soap, a sink, and them. Hanging on a polished silver rack were the guest towels. They were beautiful. Fluffy, cream-colored, probably embroidered, and radiating an aura of being completely, utterly decorative. They were the kind of towels you look at, but never, ever use, and in that moment of sheer desperation, Dave made a choice. It was a bold choice. A terrible choice. But in the war between Bob's law and his own immediate needs, it was the only choice he had. He reached for the forbidden fruit. Or rather, the forbidden fabric. What happened next was never spoken of aloud. Dave eventually emerged from the bathroom, calm and composed, rejoining the gathering as if nothing had happened. The revolution, it turned out, was silent. It was Bob's wife who discovered the aftermath later that evening while tidying up. She entered the guest bathroom and found the cream-colored towel, no longer pristine, discarded in a corner. She didn't need a forensics team to understand what had transpired. She saw the 3 unused squares still sitting by the toilet, a monument to her husband's failed regime. She saw the ruined towel, a casualty of a war he had started. No words were exchanged between husband and wife that night. No accusations were made. But the next morning, a new, full, Costco-sized roll of toilet paper appeared in the guest bathroom. And the rule was never spoken of again. The tyranny had ended, not with a bang, but with the quiet, muffled sacrifice of a very nice guest towel. Story 9. Marriage is a symphony of shared experiences. But for a symphony to work, the instruments must be in harmony. In Janice's marriage, her husband, Bill, was a broken tuba, capable of only one, soul-crushing note, played on a loop, forever. It was the sound of him eating. It wasn't just chewing. It was an auditory assault. A symphony of smacks, slurps, and guttural swallows that echoed in the quiet spaces of their home. His morning coffee was a tidal wave crashing into a cave. His evening soup was a swamp creature surfacing for air. Each meal was a fresh violation of the peace, a sound that drilled directly into Janice's sanity. She tried to fight it. At first, with subtlety. She'd compliment how quietly their friends ate. She'd accidentally turn up the television volume during dinner. She once bought him a high-end set of noise-canceling headphones, claiming they were for enjoying his music. He thanked her, and then proceeded to slurp his tea right next to her. The gentle hints escalated into direct pleas, which were met with baffled indignation. He didn't hear it. To him, this was just how one consumed food. Her growing distress was a mystery, an irrational annoyance he couldn't comprehend. And it was in his complete, oblivious denial that her frustration began to curdle into something colder, something much darker than mere irritation. The turning point came during a quiet Tuesday dinner. Bill was working on a bowl of chili. The sounds were particularly egregious that evening. And Janice found her mind drifting. She began to imagine a future, not of quiet resentment, but of a sudden, cinematic snap. A vision of herself, standing over the dinner table, the sounds finally silenced, the flashing lights of police cars painting the walls. It was a shocking, terrifying thought. But it was also clarifying. She realized this was no longer about a bad habit. This was about self-preservation. Her choices had narrowed to 2 stark options: leave her husband, or one day feature on the evening news for finally losing her temper. The divorce, in her mind, became a preventative measure. When she told her lawyer the reason, it sounded like a punchline. He smacks his lips when he eats. But Janice knew it wasn't a joke. It was a diagnosis. She wasn't just leaving a marriage, she was fleeing the scene of a future crime. Her own. Story 10. A marriage therapist had a soldier who met a local woman while stationed at Guantanamo Bay and fell madly in love. They married so she could come back to the States with him. One day, he came home to find her making spaghetti. She added the meat, the sauce, and then an unlabeled bag from the freezer. He later learned that her mother and grandmother had told her, based on an old family superstition, that to keep her men, she needed to add a very personal and deeply unconventional ingredient to his food. He couldn't get past it, and they divorced. Story 11. A marriage, at its core, is a contract. An agreement with terms both written and unwritten, spoken and assumed. It assumes shared finances, shared living space, and a certain shared intimacy. For one couple, however, it was the breach of this most unspoken term that led to a legal case so strange, it became a quiet legend in law schools. They were, by all accounts, a normal couple. They dated, they fell in love, they married. They built a life that, from the outside, looked perfectly content. They hosted dinner parties. They planned vacations. But as they approached their first anniversary, the wife sought out a lawyer. She wasn't asking for a divorce, she was asking for an annulment. A legal erasure. As if the marriage had never happened at all, the reason was as simple as it was shocking. The marriage, after nearly a year, had never been consummated. In court, the case unfolded not with anger or accusations of infidelity, but with a profound and baffling sense of mystery. The husband did not deny his wife's claim. He confirmed it. But his reasons were a shifting, flimsy wall of excuses. 1 week, he was too tired from work. The next, the room was too hot. He had headaches. He was stressed. He was worried about a project. Each excuse, plausible on its own, created a pattern of persistent, almost pathological avoidance. When viewed together, the judge grew weary of the routine. The issue was clearly not a lack of opportunity. This led the court down a different path. The problem wasn't the temperature of the room or the pressures of his job. The problem was the husband himself. The focus shifted from a simple, stubborn refusal to a question of genuine capability. It was no longer about whether he would, but whether he could. The court, delving into precedent, landed on a rarely used but powerful legal concept: psychological incapacity. The true reason for his refusal, a court-appointed psychologist suggested, was not a lack of desire for his wife, but a crippling, paralyzing fear. A deep and profound insecurity about his own physical attributes that made the act of intimacy an impossible hurdle. His mind had built a prison from which his body could not escape. The annulment was granted. The marriage was struck from the record, a ghost of a union that was never truly born. It was dissolved not by hatred or betrayal, but by the quiet, invisible force of one man's secret and unconquerable fear, leaving two people to walk away from a legal void that had once been their life together. Story 12. When the pastor's wife announced she was leaving him, she did so with a beatific smile. The small, tight-knit congregation was heartbroken but understanding. She wasn't leaving out of anger or betrayal, she explained. She was leaving to find a fresh start, to dedicate her life more fully to charity, to go out into the world and do good. It was a noble, selfless reason. And it was, of course, a complete and utter lie. Her desire for a fresh start was real, but it had nothing to do with charity. The truth was, she was having an affair. The divorce was merely a logistical step, a way to untangle herself from the men of God before publicly embracing her new life. The congregation prayed for her journey. Her husband, though devastated, wished her well, believing her to be on a righteous path. The first hint that her path was not quite so righteous came a few months later. News trickled back to the community that she had remarried, surprisingly quickly. Eyebrows were raised, but the story she had woven was a strong one. People assumed she had simply found a new partner in her charitable endeavors, a fellow do-gooder who shared her passion for helping others. The real story, however, was far more interesting than that. The man she secretly married wasn't a philanthropist. He wasn't a doctor or a missionary. He was, in fact, a convicted felon. This wasn't a youthful mistake or a minor transgression. He was a man wanted in several states for serious financial crimes, a con artist who had left a trail of ruined lives and empty bank accounts in his wake. The final, devastating revelation came when her ex-husband, the pastor, saw her face on the evening news. But she wasn't receiving an award for her humanitarian work. She was standing in the background, out of focus, as federal agents led her new husband away in handcuffs. Her fresh start wasn't a mission of charity, it was a partnership in crime. She had traded a man of the cloth for a man on the run, leaving a wake of deception that was anything but holy. Story 13 inches. The grand theater of divorce. Couples often search for a noble reason, a respectable cause for the end of a marriage. They talk of growing apart, of irreconcilable differences. And then there was Richard. When Richard decided to leave his wife of 20 years, he gave a reason so peculiar, so stunningly trivial, that it left their marriage counselor speechless. The reason, he stated with a straight face, was that she takes too long to tell a story. He painted a vivid picture of his suffering, of simple anecdotes that spiraled into epic sagas. A trip to the grocery store would become a multi-act play, complete with backstories for every person she met in the produce aisle. A funny thing the dog did would be introduced with a full genealogy of the dog's breed. He was, he claimed, a man dying a slow death by 1,000 unnecessary details. He framed his departure as an act of survival, an escape from a prison of tedious narratives. It was, on its face, completely absurd. And yet, he was so convincing in his portrayal of a man tortured by verbosity that it almost seemed plausible. Their friends were baffled. His wife was, understandably, devastated and deeply confused. How could a lifetime together be undone by a complaint about her storytelling style? The truth, as it so often does, came out a few months later. But it wasn't a sudden revelation, it was a quiet discovery. A friend saw Richard having dinner with a much younger woman, his co-worker, and the intimacy between them was unmistakable. The real reason for the divorce was the oldest, most common story in the book. He was having an affair. The complaint about her storytelling hadn't been the reason for the divorce at all. It was just the story he told himself. A bizarre, almost comically petty excuse he had constructed to avoid facing the simple, ugly truth of his own betrayal. He couldn't admit he was a cliché, so he invented a grievance so unique it was almost impressive. In the end, the men who complained about long, pointless stories had created the most pointless one of all to justify his own ending. Story 14. Her life was a portrait of comfortable normalcy. We'll call her Clara. Clara had a good job, a quiet home in a respectable neighborhood, and a loving husband named Dan. Dan was a charming man, if a little mysterious. He had no family to speak of and a vague backstory about moving around for work before he met her. But he was kind and devoted, and their life together was a calm, predictable river of domestic bliss. The river hit a waterfall one Tuesday evening. It started with a knock on the door. Not a friend. Not a neighbor. Two men in plain clothes stood on her porch, their faces grim, their eyes scanning past her into the house. They were police detectives. And they asked to speak with her husband. Only they didn't call him Dan. They used a name she had never heard before. Clara's first instinct was confusion, then polite correction. "You must have the wrong house," she said. But they didn't move. One of them produced a photograph, a driver's license from another state, issued 15 years ago. The face in the photo was younger, harder, but it was unmistakably the man who was, at that very moment, watching television in her living room. The man she knew as Den was, they explained, a wanted fugitive with a history of violence who had disappeared after a robbery gone wrong. The foundation of her world evaporated in that instant. Every shared memory, every quiet moment, every "I love you" was suddenly a lie. She had built her life on a fictional character. But the horror was only just beginning. As she stood there, numb and speechless, the second detective spoke, his voice devoid of sympathy. He explained that her husband had been using her name, her home, and their shared bank accounts to build his new identity. He wasn't just informing her of her husband's past. He was cautioning her about her own future. Because she had been unknowingly harboring a fugitive, she was now at risk. At risk of being considered an accomplice. At risk of being charged. In the space of 5 minutes, she had gone from a wife to the victim of a shocking deception. And from a victim to a potential suspect. Her home was no longer a sanctuary, it was the final scene of a long-running crime. The divorce was a mere footnote. The real end of her marriage wasn't marked by a judge's signature, but by the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs in her own hallway. Story 15. Parenthood is a masterclass in the art of letting go. You teach them to walk, only to watch them run away from you. You teach them to talk, only to have them talk back. But for some, letting go is not an art, it's an impossibility. For one husband, this impossibility was the quiet, creeping horror that dismantled his family. His wife was a loving mother. Devoted. Attentive. Perhaps, he began to realize, a little too attentive. Their son, after all, was not a small child. He was 15. A perfectly healthy, capable high schooler who was beginning to shave. Yet, his mother was still performing basic hygiene tasks for him, rituals that should have been abandoned a decade earlier. She was still supervising his bath time. When the husband first discovered the full extent of this routine, he felt a wave of disbelief, followed by a profound sense of unease. He tried to talk to her, gently. He framed it as a matter of their son's independence, his transition into manhood. This, he thought, was a reasonable, logical argument. He was wrong. His wife didn't see reason. She saw an attack. An accusation. In her mind, this was not a bizarre, arrested development, it was simply love. "He's my baby," she'd say, her voice laced with a defensiveness that left no room for debate. He realized then that he wasn't dealing with a simple bad habit. This was something deep and immovably rooted in her psyche, and he had no tools to fix it. Hoping for an ally, he approached his son. He expected to find a teenager mortified by the situation, embarrassed and eager for a way out. He was prepared to be a liberator. But what he found was far more chilling. The boy was passive. Resigned. He was so accustomed to his mother's care that he no longer recognized its strangeness. He offered no resistance, showed no desire for change. The husband looked at his son and saw not a collaborator, but a product of the system. He was the only one who saw it. He was the outsider in his own home. He filed for divorce. There was no other choice. How could he continue to live in a house where the fundamental boundaries of parenthood had been so completely and strangely erased? The reason he gave his lawyer was uncomfortable for everyone in the room, a sad, bewildering story of a mother whose love was so powerful, it refused to let her son grow up. Story 16. There are many ways to lose a partner. Some are lost to another's arms, some to the relentless grind of work, some simply to the quiet, creeping disease of indifference. But Mark was facing a uniquely modern problem. He was losing his wife, Sarah, to a universe made of pixels and code. It started as a hobby. An online role-playing game. A harmless escape. But for Sarah, the escape had become the reality. 10 hours a day, she was no longer Sarah, the suburban wife. She was Ariana, the elven sorceress, a hero in a land of dragons and magic. Mark, meanwhile, was just the guy who reminded her to eat something that wasn't delivered in a cardboard box. He felt the distance growing, a digital chasm opening between them. Their conversations became short, interrupted by the urgent call of a raid or a quest. He was living with a ghost whose heart and mind were perpetually logged in somewhere else. He tried to talk to her, to bring her back to their shared reality, but he was competing with a world infinitely more exciting than mowing the lawn. So, Mark made a desperate, slightly pathetic decision. If he couldn't reach her in the real world, he would enter hers. He wouldn't go as himself. That would invite a fight he knew he'd lose. Instead, he would go as a spy. He created a new account, a new avatar. A stoic, rugged warrior named Gideon. His mission, to find his wife in the digital wilderness and see what, exactly, had stolen her away from him. He spent days learning the game, tracking her movements, a ghost in her machine. He finally found her, not on a battlefield, but in a place the game's designers had created to be beautiful, a secluded meadow under the light of 2 digital moons. But she wasn't alone. Ariana, his wife's powerful avatar, was standing with a charismatic rogue, another player. And as Mark watched from behind a pixelated tree, he witnessed a betrayal. It wasn't physical, but it was undeniably intimate. He saw them trade items that, in the game's lore, were symbols of romantic commitment. He watched as their 2 characters performed an emote of a tender embrace, an animation designed by a programmer who likely never imagined it would be used to break a real-world heart. It was a romance in every way that mattered, except for the flesh. For Mark, that was enough. The screen was just a window, but the infidelity was real. He logged out of the game and never logged back in. The divorce papers cited the usual, irreconcilable differences. A bland, sterile phrase that couldn't possibly capture the bizarre truth of being cheated on by an elven sorceress in a land that didn't exist. Story 17. A client filed for divorce because his wife kept eating his food. One person commented that they joke about leaving their husband for the same reason. They'll bring home a dozen cookies for the week, and he will demolish them all that night. A Houston burger joint has a menu item called, "My Girlfriend Is Not Hungry," that gets you an upsized fries and 2 onion rings for this exact situation. Story 18. Some people start a home business to achieve a better work-life balance. They sell artisanal crafts on the internet, they become freelance consultants, they bake custom cakes. And then there was one woman's husband, whose entrepreneurial spirit took a decidedly more volatile direction. She knew he was involved in something from their home. He was secretive, spending long hours in the locked garage at all times of the night. He had new, expensive tastes they couldn't afford on his official salary. When she asked, he was vague. He called it specialty manufacturing. A niche market. He made it sound like he was building custom computer parts or mixing rare pigments for artists. The wife was uneasy. There was a strange, chemical smell that sometimes wafted from under the garage door. Unfamiliar people would arrive for brief, hushed exchanges and leave with heavy briefcases. She lived with a low-grade hum of anxiety, a feeling that this niche market was something far outside the bounds of the local chamber of commerce. Her anxiety turned to ice-cold fear because of a simple conversation with a neighbor. She casually mentioned her husband's strange manufacturing business. The neighbor's face went pale. She told a story about a family she knew in another town, a family whose house had been leveled in a fiery explosion. The cause? A similar, home-based lab where the husband had been involved in the illegal and highly dangerous manufacturing of illicit substances, that was it. The pieces clicked into place. The smell. The secrecy. The sudden cash. Her husband wasn't an entrepreneur. He was a chemist in a ticking time bomb, and their home, her home, was ground zero. Every click of the furnace, every hum of the refrigerator was now the potential sound of a detonator. She gave him an ultimatum: the business, or their marriage. She expected him to be shocked, maybe even apologetic. Instead, he was angry. Not that he was caught, but that she was threatening his livelihood. He chose the business. He made it clear that the dangerous, illegal operation in their garage was more important to him than her safety or their life together. The divorce wasn't just a separation, it was an evacuation. She was fleeing not just a failed marriage, but a blast radius. Story 19. A marriage can survive many things: financial hardship, arguments, even infidelity. But Sarah's marriage faced a slightly more unusual challenge. Her husband, Tom, discovered he had a gift. A special connection. He could, he claimed, talk to the dead. And the dead, it turned out, were terrible financial advisors. Their life savings evaporated into a mist of incense, spent on spiritualist retreats and certified mediums who could help Tom hone his craft. The man she married was replaced by a hollow-eyed stranger who spent his days in quiet communion with spirits only he could hear. Divorce was not a choice, it was an inevitability. By the time they sat down to divide their assets, there was nothing left but the house. Tom, in a moment of what appeared to be profound fairness, made a suggestion. "This has all been so hard on you," he said, his voice full of gentle reason. "Let me handle the sale of the house. I'll get it done quickly. We'll split the proceeds right down the middle, 50/50ths, and we can both move on." Sarah, exhausted by the spiritual circus and desperate for an end, agreed. It seemed like the one honorable thing he had offered to do in years. A few weeks passed. Tom arrived at her small rental apartment and handed her an envelope. She opened it. Inside was a check for £5. She stared at it, certain this was some kind of cruel joke. But Tom was serene. "That's your share," he explained calmly. He had sold the house for the grand total of £10. A sale is a sale, he reasoned. The paperwork was legal. She had been cheated, but it was all, technically, above board, but the true depth of the betrayal had not yet been revealed. Sarah soon learned that Tom had never moved out of the house. He was still living there, enjoying the garden, sleeping in their old bedroom. He had sold the house to his own sister for that nominal fee, a perfectly legal transaction designed for one purpose: to erase Sarah's equity and sever her from her only remaining asset. Armed with this infuriating knowledge, she stormed into the offices of her solicitors, the very firm she had paid to protect her interests during the divorce. She laid out the clear case of fraud. And in response, she received only blank stares and a nervous shuffling of papers. After a few minutes of searching their records, the solicitor cleared his throat and informed her that their firm had, in fact, handled the £10 transaction. They had represented Tom in the sale, a catastrophic conflict of interest they had either failed to notice or willfully ignored. Her own legal protectors had been paid to facilitate her ruin. Story 20. A couple I am close to were in the process of filing for divorce. One of the husband's reasons for things being irreconcilable was that his wife would always use his private bathroom. Happy to say that they worked through that issue and are still together. Story 21. An estate's paralegal saw a divorce where the defendant stopped cooking. When the petitioner gave the defendant money for housekeeping, the defendant would disappear for 2 weeks and play bingo. The defendant also lost interest in the child. Story 22. When a marriage ends, the reasons are often a tangled mess of emotion and history. but the legal arguments for why a marriage shouldn't end can sometimes be even more revealing. For one man, his argument against his wife's request for a divorce was a masterwork of insulting and bizarre logic. His wife had been diagnosed with Lyme disease. It was a difficult, draining illness that had taken a toll on her physically and emotionally. After a long struggle, she decided she no longer had the strength to remain in a marriage that was, for other reasons, no longer working. She wanted a divorce. A simple, clean break. Her husband, however, objected. Not on the grounds that he still loved her. Not with a promise to work things out. No, his argument was far more creative. He contended that his wife should not be allowed to divorce him. His reasoning: her illness. In a stunning legal maneuver, he claimed that the Lyme disease had impaired her mental faculties. He argued that she was not of sound mind, and therefore, was legally incapable of making a life-altering decision like filing for divorce. He was attempting to use her diagnosis as a weapon against her, framing her desire to leave him not as a rational choice, but as a symptom of her illness. It was an act of profound condescension disguised as concern. He wasn't trying to protect her, he was trying to trap her. He was attempting to strip her of her own agency, positioning himself as the clear-headed guardian of a woman whose mind, he alleged, had been clouded by disease. Her desire to be free was, in his narrative, merely proof of her own incompetence. The judge, needless to say, was not impressed. The argument was quickly and rightly dismissed as the desperate, insulting ploy that it was. The divorce was granted. The wife was, in the end, deemed perfectly capable of making one of the most rational decisions of her life, leaving the men who believed her illness gave him the right to control her. Story 23. The role of a soldier's mother is a noble one. She is the keeper of the home front, a pillar of support, a beacon of love and worry. And for one soldier, his mother was all of those things. And also, as it turned out, his divorce attorney. Before he deployed, the young soldier did what many soldiers do. He signed over power of attorney to his mother. It was a practical measure. She could pay his bills, manage his affairs, and handle any emergencies while he was half a world away, serving his country. He trusted her implicitly. He also, perhaps naively, trusted her to respect his marriage to a woman she famously, openly, and passionately detested. As soon as the transport plane left American airspace, his mother sprang into action. But she wasn't paying his car insurance or managing his stock portfolio. She marched into a lawyer's office, armed with the full legal authority of her son, and filed for his divorce. She used the power he had given her for his protection to dismantle the most personal part of his life. The legal machinery churned. Notices were served. Paperwork was filed. All orchestrated by a mother-in-law on a mission. Her daughter-in-law was blindsided, served with divorce papers from a husband who, at that very moment, was likely on patrol in the middle of a desert, completely unaware that his marriage was being legally executed back home. The soldier knew nothing. There were no emails, no satellite phone calls telling him his life was being rewritten by his own mother. He finished his tour and came home, dreaming of a reunion with his wife. Instead, he was met with the bewildering news that he was a single man. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks before he even stepped foot on American soil. He was a soldier, trained to fight enemies he could see. But he never stood a chance against this enemy within. He had survived a deployment to a war zone, only to come home and find his life had been sabotaged by the one person he believed was his greatest ally. The power he had granted for safekeeping had been weaponized, a legal friendly fire incident that left his marriage a casualty of war. Story 24. 2 stories. A wife wanted to divorce her husband on their wedding day because he fought with her father over the bill. Another was a woman who divorced her husband of a week because she was in love with someone else and found out he loved her too. They're married and have a kid together now. Story 25. A friend of mine divorced her husband because they were physically incompatible. They dated for about 6 months before getting married and separated 6 months after. She said their intimacy became too much work and required a lot of preparation. He was also interested in exploring more adventurous acts that she wasn't comfortable with. She showed me a picture of them, and let's just say it was clear he was a very substantially built man. Story 26. Golf is a game of quiet concentration. A gentleman's sport. A frustrating, maddening, soul-crushing battle between man and nature. For one husband, it was also a battle against his wife, a battle he was furious to be winning. He was a competitive man, a man for whom victory was everything. And he loved golf. He dragged his wife onto the course with him every weekend, insisting it be their shared passion. But he didn't want a partner. He wanted a rival. And the one thing he could not stand was that she wasn't a very good one. He wasn't upset that she would beat him. He was incandescent with rage that she couldn't even come close. Their rounds of golf became public spectacles of humiliation. If she missed a putt, he wouldn't offer encouragement. He would yell at her in front of other golfers, his voice echoing across the manicured greens. He would mock her stance, her swing, her choice of club. His favorite criticism, which he would deliver with a sneer, was to berate her for her attention to detail. What that meant in the context of golf, she never figured out. It seemed to be his catch-all term for her failure to be a worthy opponent. The issue wasn't her golf game. It was his own fragile, desperate ego. He didn't want a wife who enjoyed a hobby with him. He wanted a reflection of his own greatness. He needed to be the man who could best a skilled challenger, and her inability to be that challenger was an insult to his sense of self. Her mediocrity made his victories feel hollow. The breaking point came during a club tournament. She was playing poorly, and he was in rare form, his insults sharper and louder than ever. In the middle of the 9th hole, after he publicly ridiculed her for choosing the wrong iron, she simply set her clubs down on the grass, turned around, and walked back to the clubhouse without a word. She filed for divorce the next week. The reason, when filtered through the legal system, sounded strange: irreconcilable differences over recreational activities. But the reality was much simpler. She was divorcing a man who was angry at her for not being good enough at a game to satisfy his own need to dominate it. She was tired of being a supporting character in his one-man show of pathetic, public rage. Story 27 inches. The 1980s, romance was big. Big hair, big weddings, big gestures. For most, marriage was the ultimate destination. For a woman we'll call Penelope, it was merely a vehicle. A luxury vehicle she would ride for a very short, very specific trip, and then trade in for a newer model. Penelope loved weddings. Not the commitment, not the partnership, not the quiet building of a life together. She loved the pageantry. She loved being the center of attention, the shower of expensive gifts from a hastily assembled registry, and the roar of the party. But most of all, she loved the grand finale, the all-expenses-paid honeymoon. Her method was a masterclass in romantic fraud. She would find a successful, earnest, and slightly naive man. She would sweep him off his feet with a whirlwind romance, professing undying love and a desperate desire to be his wife. The engagement would be short, the wedding planning swift. The goal was to get from yes to I do before the groom had time to notice the faint red flags fluttering in the breeze. The wedding would be spectacular, funded, of course, primarily by the groom and his family. Then came the prize, a luxurious honeymoon in some exotic, sun-drenched locale. For 2 weeks, she would play the part of the perfect, adoring bride. And then, almost immediately upon their return, as the tans began to fade and the thank you cards were being written, the marriage would end. She would cite a sudden, heartbreaking realization. A feeling that she had, made a terrible mistake. The separation would be swift and clean. She never asked for alimony or assets. All she had wanted were the parties, the gifts, and the vacation. And once she had them, she was gone, leaving behind a bewildered ex-husband and a collection of useless wedding china. The pattern was ruthlessly efficient. In the space of about 7 years, Penelope had been married 4 times. 4 different grooms, 4 fancy weddings, 4 sets of gifts, and 4 luxurious honeymoons. She wasn't building a life. She was a serial bride, a grifter of matrimony, who had turned the sacred institution of marriage into her own personal travel agency. Story 28. A divorce attorney has seen tons of crazy reasons. One person got divorced because her husband wouldn't take her to the movies anymore. One client found out her husband was seeking paid companionship while on business trips. Another case involved teachers getting divorced because their spouses found out they were having deeply unethical relationships related to their work. And one divorce involved an elderly couple who married out of loneliness and, 2 years later, realized they couldn't stand each other.